Coming up on today's show, we're not beyond the point of no return to save Alstom's Derby works, but government must act now. We analyse our exclusive interview with Alstom MD for UK and Ireland, Nick Crossfield. The Jacobite Steam Train dispute between West Coast Railway Company and the ORR heats up yet again. And as the operator recruits MP's support, tourist businesses in the area now criticise West Coast. But there's good news too on the Hope Valley line. Hello, and welcome to Green Signals, your railway podcast from me, Nigel Harris, in a truly lovely spring day in Lincolnshire. Richard, with blue skies and apple blossom on the trees. One of those good to be alive mornings.
I'm absolutely delighted for you. It's me, Richard Bowker, here in a place that is the diametric opposite to what you've just described. Yeah. Just today, yeah.
I can see it's looking a bit dreary out the window there, at the bit of the window I can see.
Oh, I'm glad I'm inside, that's for sure.
There you go. Anyway, we had a great week last week with accelerating, and I have to say, rather dizzying growth on YouTube viewing numbers, which I'll return to in a moment. We also had our second super thanks from Rob Jones. So thanks ever so much, Rob. It gave us a real boost and we all very much appreciate the support. We'll always try to give a personal thanks on the show to anyone kind enough to give us a super thanks until there's just hundreds of them, I guess. So hopefully the trend is setting in now. What do you think, Richard?
Yeah, that'd be good, wouldn't it? So that'd be great. Anyway, thanks, Rob. Really good. Kind.
So back to that last green signals that sent numbers soaring again. Especially satisfying when we were focused on something so important, not just to the railway, but also to the UK more widely, and as it turned out, the world. This is the alarming deterioration in UK train building, with Alstom's news of redundancies in Derby. On the same day, Richard spoke brilliantly. Oh, not often going to say that, am I? But it's true. About this on BBC's Wake Up to Money programme and on Radio 4's Today, which led to a really important interview last weekend. Richard, tell us what happened.
Well, I'm just recovering from you describing me as talking brilliantly. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It all happened very fast, actually. As you said, did the two interviews. Actually, one of them are worth listening. I don't know if you can still get them on catch up. They're definitely worth listening to. The Wake Up to Money one had a guy who, Darren, his name was production manager at Litchurch Lane, Derby Litchurch Lane, and he was terrific. He was what I would call unfiltered. It was very professional, but it was very raw, and he described the impact on people, which I thought politicians should listen to. But Nick Crossfield, who's the MD, got in touch. We had a good chat, and we ended up recording an interview over the weekend, which you can watch on YouTube. We'll put a link in the description to that. If you're on Spotify, if you listen to it on audio, don't worry, we put it on audio as well, so it's also on Spotify.
Just let me butt in there with another word of praise. Yesterday, because it was a great job securing that, Richard, we had a text from better not say the name and embarrass them, but from a national transport journalist on a newspaper, actually, congratulating us on an exclusive and beating everybody to the punch on that one. So
yeah, that was very nice. So we shan't say who, but thank you.
Is always good. Yeah,
indeed.
Anyway, off you go.
Well, so what did we cover? Well, it's only about 30 minutes, and it is worth listening to the interview. We basically covered like the whole experience a whole process that Alstom have gone through over the last 12 months. And what comes across is it's just an extraordinary amount of, dithering, for want of a better word, just the inability for anybody on the government side to seem to want to or be able to make a decision, which
maybe
was
both.
just, I think it probably is. I mean, the context of this is really interesting. Train building in the UK has always had its kind of issues. It's always been a bit up and down, cyclical and so on. But it's been made worse because of decisions that the Department of Transport took a number of years ago. I mean,
or hasn't taken.
Well, it's maybe the ones they did take that have caused the problem. It's the ones they're not taking now that are causing the bigger problem. But the ones they did take, what they did was in the franchises, they added in like this quality factor that made it a good thing for your bid to put in new trains, whether or not they were really wanted, right? So I think, Roger Ford of Modern Railways estimates that in 2018, they bought like 4 years worth of orders in 1 year. And what that did is it pulled forward future orders. And if you do that, inevitably you create a trough, right? And it's the trough that we're kind of now in. So 12 months ago, Alstom, who were the ones who just were in the process, not at that point still doing a lot of building, but they were coming towards the end of their Aventra EMU order, which is like 2,500 vehicles, I think, in total. And they were a year away from the end, and they said to the government, look, if you don't bring forward some new orders, we're going to have a problem.
Run out of work, in other words.
Absolutely. I mean, the factory are literally... in terms of new build, I mean, Alstom are not daft. They were trying to get refurbishment works in there.
And they've got overseas stuff as well.
And they've got some overseas stuff as well. But, new build in the UK is obviously a really important part of what they do. So they sat down with the department, said, look, we need to sort this out. There is going to be a gap. And the government, with some justification said, well, there's some new orders coming. And Alstom said, well, fine, but when are they coming to market? We need some confidence around that. And there are lots.
And they can plan for it then as well.
And they can plan for it. I mean, there's loads of stuff coming, Southeastern and Chiltern and Transpennine and Northern. There's loads of stuff coming, but it's just not like now. So they sat down and had those conversations, and it was clearly going to be very difficult. I mean, one of the things that Alstom offered was they said, look, to help this stopgap, if you will help us with some UK orders, and come back to that in a minute, we will do our bit, we'll invest, we will do what's necessary, and we will move a contract which Alstom won before they bought Bombardier, right? We'll move it from the plant we were planning to build it in, which is in Poland, and we'll move that into Derby, which actually cost them money. But
so they weren't just saying, look, we want a bailout, we want you to help. They were saying, we will do our bit at our own expense.
Well, actually, Nick was really clear in the interview. They never asked for a bailout. They never asked for funding. They never asked for a loan. They never asked for a grant.
Just for a modest order to help see them through.
And the order they suggested was actually a run-on order, or an option, if you like, for more Aventras, some for South Western Railway and some for TfL. Now, the TfL ones they're easier because TfL is funded directly by the Treasury, whereas there's a Roscoe involved in South Western. So it was more straightforward to do TfL. And don't forget, Nigel, these TfL want some extra trains for the Elizabeth line because it's booming like crazy.
So the trains are wanted.
Yeah.
It's a fairly straightforward run-on order. They can just tag it on the end of what they're already building.
Yeah.
We're going to need them anyway, so you get the best price now rather than tooling up again in the future when they need it and having to restart the line. I mean, the words no-brainer spring to mind, really.
You would think so, wouldn't you? So Alstom said, but we need to know by September last year, by September 23, why? Because the Irish Rail contract that we've won, which is about 500-600 vehicles over 10 years, we've got to start going into production. And once we've gone into production, we can't move it. So guess what happened in September?
Nothing.
Correct. Deadline came and went. So that was lost. And that would have been a real coup, a nice export order. So then Alstom
Brexit benefit, one might say.
Yeah, 2 words you don't normally appear in the same sentence.
Absolutely
slightly
not.
Giving the game away. So then Alstom said, look, okay, but we've got a hard stop coming in February or March 24 when Aventra finishes. We're going to have to start the process. We are duty bound to start the process of telling the staff what's happening and starting consultations around redundancies. Because
in February, when the work runs out, then they can't keep people on. So that's the hard stop. So the government missed the deadline on the Irish order. And now Alstom are saying, we're going to run out of time in February. We've got to start the process now. We need to get on.
Correct. So that did, of course, stir the government into action because that's job losses. And it's not just the people in the factory. I mean, factories sort of up to 3,000 people, but there's about 12 or 13,000 in what they call the supply chain, all
surrounding Derby and elsewhere.
And in the East Midlands, I mean, I think some national ones, but certainly local regional supply chain who do very specialist bits of stuff for train building. Well, they're all affected as well. So they started that process. The government, hang on a minute. And actually, Mark Harper then stirred into action and said, just before Christmas, right, we are going to sort out an additional order for sort of 10 9-car Aventras or whatever, 90, 100 vehicles, whatever. And we're going to all work really hard and we're going to get it done by the end of January.
Well, I think he gave a commitment, didn't he? Because you mentioned that in the run-up to your interview with Nick, that they would get this out by the end of January.
Well, certainly that was his clear intention. And Nick said, I went away for Christmas, with that ringing in my ears. So guess what happened?
Enjoy his sprouts.
Indeed. Guess what happened at the end of January?
Nothing again.
Correct. So at that point, and by the way, they've paused the consultation process with staff because the government asked them to. So they have to restart that. And so that kind of brings us up to today, really. And it's just like, it's still dithering. And I don't know why. We did explore in the interview a little bit why, but that's the position today.
Can I ask out, outright, is it deliberate? Is it capricious? Is it duplicitous? Is it deliberate messing around? Is it incompetence? Is it weakness on behalf of the Secretary of State? What do you think it is?
Well, I mean, it's such a good question. All my experience has been that if you think it's a conspiracy or you just think it's cock up, it's usually cock up, right?
We're not clever enough for conspiracies.
Well, I think it comes down to two things: fear and weakness. And what I mean by fear is there'll be some civil servant somewhere or some advisory lawyer saying, oh, yes, but Secretary of State, I mean, that's quite a brave decision because we might get challenged on this piece of procurement law or what. I mean, seriously, guys, nobody in their right mind is going to object to this. I mean, you would not. These Aventra trains for TfL, it would be madness to get a small sub-order from someone else.
So what you're saying is another manufacturer would not be interested in designing, tooling up and producing a sub-fleet that was different of 10 trains. It would cost a fortune.
Well, they might be interested and they might sort of play games a bit, but I think the risk of it being successful is very, very low if you manage it properly. And a Secretary of State is entitled to make a direction. Patrick McLaughlin did make a direction.
Didn't he?
Which I think brings you to the second point about weakness, really. It's just like, Mr. Harper, just, your job is to listen to all the advice and then decide. They always say officials advise, ministers decide. So I think it's a combination of those two things.
I'm trying
fear
not to.
And weakness.
Sorry, Richard, Ed's fearing weakness. I'm trying not to say that the Secretary of State should just grow a pair and get on and make the decision.
Well, I would certainly resist the temptation if you could.
Yeah, okay, I'll resist it. One last thing, though. I mean, in the past, the entire time I was on rail, 28 years, this happened a time or two, and maybe there's an element of the boy who cried wolf about this, because the expression sort of Derby and shroud waving were said several times, and I must admit I spoke those words 10 or 15 years ago. But this time it is different. There is a wolf. And one of the pieces of information which really had a big impact on me, excuse me, was that two of the companies that Nick knew he would need when that commitment that Mark Harper had made came to fruition and the order came through were going bust. And so he effectively took the businesses over, didn't he, to protect them, to make sure they were still there when that commitment made by the Secretary of State came to pass.
Yeah, he took the people. I think the businesses went into administration, but he took the people.
But you take the point, yeah.
But the outcome's the same, yeah.
And he's still paying them, isn't he?
He's still paying them, right? And anybody who's spent time with Nick Crossfield, right, it takes you about 30 seconds to realise that this is a very straightforward,
very articulate, measured,
down the line, measured, professional committed guy. In fact, the only time you could sense him getting a bit agitated was when he talked about the people. He clearly cares about Derby, the place,
men and women,
and the people that work there. Yeah, I mean, you can really tell that comes through loud and clear. So this is if they've been guilty of shroud waving in the past, this time
this isn't it.
It's real. Yeah.
Just one last point has suddenly struck me there. That he tupied those people from those two businesses which were essential to building the new trains, so that they will be there available when the Secretary of State made good on his commitment at the end of January. And here we are in mid-April, and he is still paying those people as an act of good faith. And so a commitment which was due at the end of the January, which failed to materialise and is still not in place. And we're now, as you memorably said in your intro to that fantastic interview with Nick, we're at a minute to midnight, aren't we?
Yeah. Do you know the most extraordinary thing that came out of the interview, and that I had not really clocked? One of the other things that they've offered the Department for Transport is that if they can get through this next 18 months and they need a relatively small run on order to give them a UK base, they will then put some refurb in, they will then invest in the plant, because it's actually slightly bigger than what you really need, medium to long term anyway, so they'll put the money in for that. And they will make Derby the centre of excellence globally for their new electric multiple unit commuter rail product, which they call the Odessia, globally. So all the design, all the manufacturing, all the bidding internationally will all be hosted out of Derby. That is an extraordinary thing, and that's what's at stake here.
And what that would do, as far as you can make such a comment as I'm about to make, is that it would secure Derby's future. So if you step right back for this and look where we are at the minute, what we're facing is oblivion or rebirth for Derby because of the weakness whatever at the DFT.
And you know the exchange of letters that we had between Louise Haig and Mark Harper? She wrote to him. He wrote back and said, a big long letter that was
quite
okay.
Condescending letter.
Well, it was a bit, but it also said, well, it's not really down to us. I mean, it's the TOCs that place the contracts.
Oh, yeah, we can't affect these things.
Yeah, well, she replied back to him and said, no, come on. Yeah, and she called him out on it. It was actually a great letter. So she put it pretty well as well. So I think that description of it's on your your decision, Mark, right? You can decide whether it closes or whether Derby becomes a global centre of excellence
again. And it's down to him right now. So Secretary of State, please extract your digit and just make this decision. 10 trains, which we're going to need anyway, which will cost a fortune in the future, and which are an extension of what they're already building. What more ticks in what more boxes could you want? And yeah, you're right about Louise Haig. She resisted the temptation to be provoked by, the stuff that he'd said. In the words of Michelle Obama, when he went low, she went high.
I like that. It's good.
Anyway, shall we move on?
I think we should.
Go on then. On to our next piece of news. Here we go again. On to our next piece of news. We cannot ignore that the Jacobite Steam Train dispute has become even more of a standoff, with both MPs and local businesses becoming involved on both sides of the argument. I'm putting in mind of those westerns with Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef, Richard, of them facing each other 25 metres away. And I won't do the music, you'll be delighted to hear.
I am delighted.
Just turn around on that piano and give us a quick burst of the good, the bad, and the ugly. There you go.
Another time, perhaps.
Another time, indeed. So look, seriously, this developing mess is not only very damaging for the regional economy, but there are key principles at stake for safety regulation in general, and the ORR's credibility and reputation in particular. So let's just have a quick recap. And I know you'll correct me if I get it wrong, Richard, so deep breath. West Coast has been denied another exemption by ORR that would enable them to run trains without central door locking. This is what West Coast comprehensively lost a judicial review over in December last year, and we've covered that. West Coast has submitted an application for a new long-term exemption to continue running its Mark 1s with secondary door locking with manual deadbolts operated by stewards rather than central door locking operated by the guard from a single switch at the end of the train. And the operator tells us on its website that its submission does not commit to fitting of CDL. That is a crucial point, and Richard and I will come back to it. Assessment of exemption applications and the associated risk assessments by ORR can take around 4 months to complete, hence the application for a temporary exemption. West Coast has submitted an application for this temporary exemption to enable it to continue running its non-compliant carriages while the long-term application is assessed. This is intended to see them through the rapidly approaching Jacobite summer season that will be lost, together with its revenue, while it waits for the assessment to be completed. So I know you and Steph have been doing a lot of work on this, Richard. What's happened now?
Well, quite a lot. It is.
I'm
they say.
agog.
Are you really? It is, as they say, a developing situation, and it is important for all the reasons you say, because there's an awful lot at stake here. Principles. Well, one thing that West Coast Railways have done, which is very helpful, they've kind of kept us updated as to what their thinking is. We may not necessarily all agree with it, but they've been
enthusiastic about updating.
Yeah. So on their website, there's a news item as like a landing page, to use the website speak, and that does keep getting updated. And at the moment, we're talking about the version that was on the 8th of April, right? So we're recording this
2 days later
on the 10th. Yeah. But this is the version that was on the 8th.
Okay.
So the way they've done it is they've sort of done it like a little kind of Q&A. They've sort of done it to themselves, like, what about this? Well, this is what we think. What about that? So they go through all of that. Yeah, it's quite, it's helpful actually. So the first headline they've put on this is, why is West Coast Railways requesting that it should receive an exemption from the regulations? Fair question, right? So their answer to their own question is, well, we've had an exemption under various for the last 30 years for these carriages, right? It's not quite, because it's 1999, but anyway, but it's and then they also say that in the court case, the judicial review that got determined in December last year, they then quote what the judicial review said about an aspect of this. And I'm just going to read this because it's important. They put it in quotation marks and they say, the ORR's policy gives a strong steer that central door locking will be required, but it nonetheless makes clear that ORR will consider granting an exemption from Regulation 5, that's the relevant one around central door locking, where an applicant can demonstrate there are exceptional circumstances. Right?
Got it.
This is what the court said. Right? And then they go and they said, it is expected that any deviation from the policy provide an equivalent level of safety protection to central door locking, right? But the requirement is not mandatory. So they quote that. And then they say they have their own analysis, if you like, and say, due to this clarification by the court, it is West Coast Railways' contention in their application for an exemption continuation and in the comprehensive risk assessment attached to the application produced by an independent health and safety company, and wait for it, this is the key, that the current method of having 2 door locks fitted to each door, one main lock and a secondary deadbolt, just as you've described, plus having a steward present in each carriage, is far safer than having to spend millions of pounds to fit CDL. Right?
What?
Well, that's what they say. Okay. So really, West Coast Railways are saying, and by the way, we should just be clear, we're not lawyers, right? And we're not technical specialists. We're informed, interested observers, right? So these are our we think, our reasonable opinions based on what we read. If anybody else thinks differently, they need to tell us.
And we are entitled to an opinion.
We absolutely are. So here's the opinion. So the opinion is that it feels like West Coast are saying that they believe secondary door locking and stewards is far safer than central door locking.
What?
But that's despite the judgment from the court in December rather suggesting that they thought ORR had acted perfectly rationally in enforcing what they had decided to enforce.
I don't think they suggested it. I think they said it outright.
Yeah. So that is quite an odd statement from West Coast Railways. So, but that is their view. They obviously believe it, but they kind of say it as if everybody else, you'd be a bit daft not to agree with them, which
exactly.
I suppose is the. So then they go on, West Coast Railways. They say other companies, other operators are operating on the mainline rail network using the same Mark 1, Mark 2 carriages, the ones with hinge doors, that West Coast Railways use without having CDL fitted. The ORR has allowed them to continue to run under an exemption granted by the ORR, even though these carriages have not been fitted with CDL. West Coast Railways has not been granted the same exemption as these other operators.
So they're claiming they've been singled out unfairly.
That is the sense of that, isn't it? Right. So you have to then peel that back and go, are they being treated differently?
And I have to say, on the face of it, if that is true, they might have a point, but let us continue.
Well, the good news is when you investigate it, it's clear that it's not the case, right?
It's not true, is it?
It's
just not true.
ORR has confirmed to us, that's Green Signals, that no operator is running under the type of exemption that West Coast Railway is seeking. Operators who use carriages on the main line and running them as a mainline operation, I'll come back to that point, which are not at the today fitted with CDL, are only allowed on the railway, the mainline
under
network,
that exemption that West Coast quotes.
Under the exemption they've got, if they've either started the fitment process for CDL or the exemption has been granted on the basis that they have committed to a fully financed fitment program of CDL, whereas West Coast Railways have made no such commitment. That's the difference.
So the only way they're running those things is if people have actually started fitting them already, or they've got an agreed plan with the money ready to do it, and OR is giving them time to carry that out.
That's the only basis you get an exemption. So it's not correct to say, other people are running them with an exemption, an open-ended exemption.
Why can't we?
The exemption is if you've started fitting it or you've got a plan that's fully financed.
So the reasonable deduction from that is if West Coast pitched up at ORR and said, here's our plan to fit CDL and we have committed to it and here is the money to do it, they would probably get the exemption that they seek to give them time to do it like everybody else. Yeah,
I think the ORR have always been clear about that. I mean, then that was said in the JR judgment. Yeah.
Right. So that clears that murky pool. Well, at least in terms of understanding on a wider basis. One question we did get from a listener, Richard, echoes a concern of mine, actually, that popped up in my head when we were talking about this last time, so I'm glad it's come up, was about the North Yorkshire Moors Railway and its extension service to Whitby, which uses, uses Mark 1s running over 6 miles of Network Rail metals between Gromont and Whitby. Does West Coast have a point that there are different rules in play here?
It is a very good question. No, they don't. And the reason is because, again, we asked about this and we looked specifically into the North Yorkshire Moors situation. Their exemption is, these things are on a case-by-case basis, but their exemption is quite specific because they only run those 6 miles at 25 miles an hour. Now, you'll know from your Great Central Railway days that 25 miles an hour is the absolute limit for a heritage railway.
It's a Transport and Works Act legislation stipulates that speed. And
it's sacrosanct, isn't it?
Well, it is. And in the days before GPS speed recording things, railways did push the luck, but it was made very clear to me when I was a director of the GCR that if we catch you lot speeding, you're for it. So they do keep an eye on it. And of course, YouTube, you can see it.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely right. So when the North Yorkshire Moors are operating on that section, they are effectively running it as an extension of a heritage line, right? I mean, they are running at 25 miles an hour. There are some other things we understand in their comprehensive risk assessment, which includes the train is fully ticketed and booked. Everybody's got a seat, so on and so forth. It's single line. So
there's nothing coming the other way.
No, they're not going to pass anything coming the other way. But that's why the North Yorkshire Moors Railway are allowed to do it, because it's very specific set of circumstances.
It's a de facto extension to the NYMR for these services only.
Yeah.
And because everybody's ticketed and seated, you're not going to get people... Well, there's no need for anybody to be stood at doors by a drop light.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why heritage railways are okay with Mark 1s, because they're also restricted to 25 miles an hour and they have their own very specific risk assessments.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So take us forward, Richard.
So we're then going back to this piece on the landing page of West Coast Railways on their website. They then go on, they kind of say, so because there are other people running on the railway without CDL, and yet they've got an exemption, we'll just explain why that's not entirely correct. They then go on to say, so as this policy is deemed as the ORR's policy, right? So as this policy is deemed to be about safety, it's clear from this, this previous point, that there is no short-term safety issue with the carriages. Otherwise, no operator would be allowed to run these carriages without having CDL fitted. I have to say, conveniently forgetting to point out its very specific terms, and it's also because they've agreed to a fitment plan. So that's absolutely critical.
I think that comes under the heading of economical with the actuality, doesn't it?
Well, I'd just say it's just wrong.
Not true.
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned the JR judgment again, Richard, which West Coast lost comprehensively, if I recall, on every one, was it 5 points?
5 points, yeah.
That it was founded on. And one of the other questions we were asked is why the JR cited two fatalities attributed to drop-light windows when CDL wouldn't of itself make the risk of falling from windows or being struck by passing objects any lower.
Yeah, and this is a point that a couple of people made on YouTube, wasn't it? They said,
yeah,
hang on a minute, what's that got to do with CDL? And it's correct that of itself, CDL doesn't affect those things. But it goes back to this point about a comprehensive risk assessment. So the issue here is hinged doors, which have these drop lights, and also the risk of being struck by something if you've got your head out of a window.
Because people have been killed.
Well, they have. Well, those
charter passengers have been killed by
yeah.
leaning out a window and hitting a bridge or something.
So as part of an exemption application to be allowed to run a Mark 1 or a Mark 2 with hinged doors, your risk assessment has got to be absolutely comprehensive. You've got to cover every base in that. And the good news is that health and safety legislation doesn't expect you to reduce risk to absolute zero. It's done under a principle called ALOP, which is as low as reasonably practicable. But you've got to demonstrate what practical measures you're taking to mitigate the risk. So with drop lights, for instance, there's maybe different approaches. So Safos trains, we know, which we talked about last time, they've put, I think, a diagonal bar across the window, which doesn't particularly look very nice, but it means you can get your hand out to open the door, but you can't get your head out to get it hit by a bridge.
And that's not new, Richard, is it? I mean, on the West Cumbrian coastline, the energy coastline, as Rishi Sunak would have it, back in the days of BR Mark 1 DMUs, there's very restricted clearances on that line, and those DMUs had 3 parallel bars across those drop light windows, so you could get your hand out to open the door, but you couldn't not
get your head out.
This is not new.
No, it's exactly the same point. So, and it can also include on-train announcements and stewards patrolling the trains, which actually West Coast Railways say we use stewards, right? So they've got some of the elements there, but it's part of a total comprehensive risk assessment. But then West Coast Railways make a remarkable statement on their website. They say, and I must admit, I kind of scratched my head at this one. West Coast Railways have requested, wait for it, and fully expect to receive, as other operators have, a temporary exemption whilst the ORR considered its full application. Now,
it's revisiting that being singled out point again, isn't it?
Well, there is a sort of a there's a presumption there that, we will get this. Well, okay. I'm not sure I would phrase it that way when you're trying to get a regulator to buy into your approach, but, that's their business, not ours. But we've explained, there's no other operator on the mainline network running as a mainline operation that has an exemption, but without having either started fitting it or with a fully financed plan to fit it, number one. And number two, there's nobody operating with a temporary exemption whilst their full application for an exemption is heard. So that just was absolutely an extraordinary statement, really. And it doesn't explain what's actually going on.
And given it's so complex, it's really important that we keep dispelling this stuff, because there is a bit of a principle, and I've seen it before in journalism, that if you repeat an untruth often enough, other people start to repeat and report it, and it becomes seen as a trib. And we've seen that all the time with HS2, haven't we? Oh, it's all about speed to Birmingham, and it never was. So we've got to keep dispelling this nonsense. This caught my eye, Richard. West Coast say at the bottom of the page we've just been reading from, quote, "We are working closely with ORR to reach a speedy conclusion to this, but until then, we have had to suspend running the Jacobite. This is affecting not only West Coast, but over 100,000 passengers, the majority of whom are tourists to the West Highlands, and this in turn affects thousands of local businesses and employment in the area." Now, you can see what they're trying to do there.
Yeah, and, some of that is correct. It is affecting a lot of people, most of whom are tourists. It is affecting the local economy. There's no debate about that, really. But you can't then say, because of something you've done to us, right?
That's the point.
And that's the point, isn't it? But what you can see is it's moved now into sort of a campaigning thing, a lobbying, a sort of PR exercise. One of the things they've done, which you mentioned at the top of this, they've got MPs to quite a sort of an eclectic bunch of MPs. You'd think they were all Scottish MPs along the line of route.
Well, I did, but they're not, are they?
No, I mean, when I looked at the letter, one of them was my local MP in Derbyshire Dales.
Wasn't that Patrick's old seat?
It was indeed, yeah. But it no longer is, obviously. But very odd. But they've got them to countersign this 4-page letter, which just repeats a lot of the stuff that we've just gone through. And what they're trying to do is put pressure onto Hugh Merriman to intervene. Well, I mean, I was quite shocked by that, right? I mean, this is an independent safety regulator, and you're asking a minister to
the Crown
to use political influence on a safety matter with a regulator. No. There is no way. Hugh Merriman is a smart cookie. He's not going to do that, and you shouldn't really ask him, because that would be would be just wrong.
And he won't. But I think the most depressing thing, and I don't blame, I mean, when you're when you're on the ropes, you swing the punches wherever you can, wherever you think you might land one. But I think it is monumentally depressing that so many MPs have got so little understanding of the real world that they have put their name to a commercial operation urging them to put pressure on a minister of the Crown to interfere, not only with with a regulator, but a safety regulator. How naive, brackets, stupid, can you get? And yet these are the people sitting in 640 odd seats in the House of Commons deciding our lives.
Yeah, well, I can't add to that. This issue is going to not get decided in the court of public opinion. This issue is it might get decided in the courts, but it ain't going to get decided that way. And they run the risk of looking rather foolish, I agree.
Yes. So what did catch my eye quite significantly as well, Richard, you mentioned the court of public opinion. Well, you've got protagonists on each side of the argument there, haven't you? And I was fascinated to see a really interesting story in the Herald this week, headlined, "Firms accuse Harry Potter train owners of, quote, atrocious behaviour." To her great credit, journalist Caroline Wilson dug deeper and went out interviewing the West Highlands business community that relies on tourism provided by the Jacobite Steam Train. Now, she did. She went by a very old rule in journalism, which is when if somebody tells you it's raining, it's not your job to report it. It's your job to go to the ... window and look. And she went to the window and looked. And she discovered that the very people who West Coast claim to be fighting for are actually showing, and I quote, little sympathy for the train operator. One business owner, Joe Blower, runs wildlife cruises timed to fit in with the trains, described it as outrageous, and his comments were really interesting. He said this: "As an operator involved in public transport, we are governed by the Maritime Agency. We have inspections out of the water, in the water, every year. And if they don't like something, you have to put it right. Otherwise, they just tie your boat up. How have they got away with this for 20 years, just getting a concession every year, and now they've given us a week's notice of the train's not running? They have made bucket loads of money out of the Harry Potter train. They are not short of money. They have brought us a lot of business, and we are grateful. But on the same score, they need to comply with their regulations, just like I have to do with my boats. I thought that sort of was a very powerful and revealing comment. The lines are really being drawn, aren't they?
Yeah, and he wasn't the only one. There's quite a lot of those in that particular piece. Yeah, I mean, they are being drawn, and but others are getting stuck in on the action now. So LSL, Locomotive Service Limited, who also have a charter train business.
Jeremy leaps in.
Yeah, so on Monday and Tuesday of this week that we're recording, they ran a charter service, the West Highlander, they called it, from, guess where, Fort William to Mallaig.
Really?
Yeah, they did it at a slightly cheaper price as well. It wasn't a steam engine, right? It was classic traction, as they say. But nonetheless, they ran that. They ran that as a charter train, so they ran it in what timetable is called white space.
And this is a really important point, actually.
Yeah, because what happened was, I think the second the West Coast Railways got a whiff of that, they sent up a rake of a set of coaches and a couple of locos, and ran empty coaching stock in the paths of the Jacobite, which it's very important that they don't lose those. But if they don't use them, you lose them. Right?
A bit like slots at Heathrow, where they fly empty aircraft around just to keep a slot.
So never mind the carbon emissions, taking a pair of Class 37s all the way up to the West Highland of Scotland. But we had the absurd sight, and it was absurd, frankly, because it's a single track, so there's passing places, of the LSL charter in a passing the empty coaching stock of in the Jacobite path going the other way. I mean, you just kind of go, jeepers, it's all getting a bit daft, really.
But your point about the paths is a very good one, isn't it? If they don't use them, they will lose them in October, because they are effectively, passenger service paths, aren't they? If you remember, I made a comment last time.
No, actually, I think they expire in October. I think you have to if you don't use them for 90 days, you can lose them.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I think
that's why they're running the empty trains. But but they are proper service paths, aren't they?
Yes, it's in the working timetable. Yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. If you remember, I commented, I think in the last but one pod, that Scotland's Mr. Railways Bill Reeve has told me on a number of occasions the Jacobite is the only timetable passenger train in Scotland he does not have to support.
No, indeed. I also wonder whether this is something to do with brakes. I know that's a really weird left field comment.
Leap.
But, well, only because the Mark 1s can be vacuum braked or dual braked. I think Mark 2s can only be either vacuum braked or air braked, I think. But some of the steam locomotives that West Coast Railway use are dual braked. They've got vacuum and air, and some are vacuum only. And you have to have an air reservoir compressor to operate central door locking. If you don't, if it's vacuum braked only, then it's a more expensive central door locking solution. It's an electric mechanical one. So I think actually possibly the number and the type of coaches and the access to the locomotives that they got might also be playing factories, because if it could end up being a very expensive solution, which maybe that's part of it. I don't know.
But it's not beyond the wit of man.
Well, there's solutions out there. There's solutions out there. There's operators that have fitted central door locking systems on vacuum brake stock. Yeah.
Okay. Well, a developing story which we shall be keeping our eye on, won't we?
Indeed.
It's a complete and avoidable dog's breakfast. And we'll just have to see how it develops. We will be coming back to it. I suppose summing it up in words of one syllable, as you might say in a table and pub, West Coast strategy seems to be just dig its heels in and hope to get its own way eventually by just wearing down ORR's resolve, yeah?
It's quite a high-risk strategy, isn't it?
It is. It is. There comes a point, doesn't there, when however much you believe something, you've got to be pragmatic and think, I'm not going to win this. There's no point in going out for battles that you're going to lose, is there?
Indeed. Shall we move on to the quiz?
Well, yeah, because this is going to be quite interesting. There was a very, very interesting tweet this week. I wish I'd written down who it was, but it was tongue-in-cheek. But this chap said, there's going to have to be a steward's inquiry about Richard's question. He said, because I can think of at least 3 answers. He said, you commendably sought clarification and were rebuffed. And I was. Over to you.
Well, there doesn't need to be a steward's inquiry. I'm delighted to say. And as I said, the reason why I did rebuff, very, very gently and politely, of course.
Oh, it was very elegant, but you didn't say clear off effectively.
Was because if I'd answered the question, I'd have given away, the twist in the question.
What you actually said was, all you need is in the question.
And I was right about that, because I said, which British rail locomotive only had 1 member of its class, right? And the key was British Rail. Now, so British Rail as a trading name started in 1965.
That's when the BR board was established, I think, wasn't it? From the old British
I think the British Railways Board was technically established before that. It came out of the British Transport Commission.
Yeah, but I thought that was the same time. Anyway, okay.
Oh, possibly. But the trading name British Rail was 1965, definitely. So that means that if you came up with 71,000 Duke of Gloucester, which was a good shout because it only had 1 member, that was British Railways, because it was pre-65.
And there was a Licky Banker as well, which was a...
Yeah, that was like really old. Being Big Bertha's was like a Midland Railway design, I think.
Railway,
But so that was definitely, I think that was pre-grouping, right? But if you came up with a lot of the pilot scheme diesels like Falcon or Kestrel or Lion or the gas turbine GT3, all great answers, but sadly all pre-1960. Well, no, yeah. Well, yeah, all right. Fair enough. So, good effort. So, post-1965, I think there's only one answer, which is the... grief. Which is the Class 89001, nicknamed the Aardvark or the Badgerers, the electric loco that GNR used actually on...
They brought it back when they brought it back.
Yeah. And we will have it back. We will have it back again because the aforementioned LSL are restoring it to mainline use. So that's the answer. However, there was if you're very, very clever, there is, and 2 people were this clever, there was a thing called a Class 19. I don't know if it still exists.
I'd never heard of this.
No. Well, I kind of vaguely had, but it was only when somebody gave it as an answer that it came back to me. A Class 19 was a test vehicle converted from one of those DVTs, those driving van trailers. And they put a cab at the back of it so you could drive it from both ends, a bit like a 91 looks like, actually. And I think it was a test for some sort of fancy propulsion system or hydrostatics. I can't remember exactly. But I don't believe it ever carried the number 19001. I don't believe it ever pulled anything on the national rail network. I think it actually
went
was trialled
into service at all.
Well, it definitely didn't do that, but I think it was trialled on the Bowness and Kinneil Railway or something.
Okay.
Like. But so I had a conversation with myself and decided that was too niche as a test vehicle. So 89001 wins. But if you came up with the Class 19, you're very clever. All right, you just didn't win. And the winner with 89001, which was massively fast out the stops, was Gary Williams on YouTube.
It was minutes, wasn't it? It was really
very quick.
Gary was absolutely startlingly fast off the
And what was amazing, all the other answers came after he'd said 89001, which was quite funny.
Because they obviously hadn't seen it. Yeah.
Well, that's possible. Gary, send us an email to info@greensignals.org and we will get you your mug. There you go. Yeah,
just while you talk about mugs, Richard.
Yeah.
I think we should think. Well, I think we should talk about travel mugs. Because for doing these podcasts, the reason I am using it is my coffee goes cold. And I've got a selection of these. I've got LNER and Traveller's Insurance and Eversholt and all the rest. This one's an intuitive one, but it keeps me coffee warm for the whole podcast. So how about we do some travel mugs?
Right. Well, I'll have a word with Nina Lockwood from Intuitive, so she can tell us who her supplier was, and maybe we'll have a look at that. So Nina, incoming. Right, okay. So the quiz for this week, it was too easy last week, clearly. I mean, it was a bit controversial, but it was quite easy. So we're ratcheting it up. We're ratcheting. Oh, I can't even say that.
Ratcheting.
Yeah, that's the word. Thank you.
You absolutely have. I was completely nonplussed when you told me this one.
Okay. What is the link, the connection between these 4 towns? Richmond, as in the Yorkshire variety, Colville, Bideford, and Thrapston. So I'll say that again. What's the link between those 4 towns? And remember, we're a railway podcast, right?
I have absolutely no idea.
Colville, Bideford, and Thrapston. If you think you know, let us know via the usual means, YouTube, Twitter, whatever. And first correct answer gets a wonderful mug.
I wonder if there'll be a tsunami of answers.
Oh, right. I don't know. But it's a good one, though, isn't it?
We are having to go farther and farther into the esoterics, aren't we, to try and catch the beggars out?
They are. People are getting very good at this.
They are very savvy. Anyway, let us move on to the good news.
Yeah.
Rail Minister Hugh Merriman visited Dore Totley station in Yorkshire this week to mark completion of the Hope Valley upgrade. He officially opened the station's 2nd platform. It's the first time since the 1980s that the station has had 2 platforms. Doubtless a legacy of those awful 1980s rationalisations like at Swindon and Princess Risborough, where they concentrated all the services on one platform. And you put Swindon right, Richard, as I recall.
Indeed so.
A fully accessible footbridge with lifts at both ends, even though they look hideous, has been installed to connect the new Platform 2 with the existing Platform 1, which has been extended to accommodate longer trains of 6 carriages. So there's a bit of a capacity uplift there in terms of carrying capacity. It's part of the £150 million Hope Valley upgrade, which began in 2021 and which has brought significant improvements to the line between Manchester and Sheffield, which is absolutely brilliant. And at no time in that news item was the words Woodhead and reopening mentioned, which is something, isn't it?
It is. It is good news, but no. Because you could be
never
forgiven.
Knowingly let a good news item go by.
No, this is great, right? And it was a ridiculous rationalisation, and like Swindon or like Proburst Burngullow, which was a really daft one. Which, if you're watching on YouTube, that picture in the background is of the redoubling of Proburst Burngullow. They were daft rationalisations, right? It is good. The problem is that they haven't spent all that money on Dore Totley station, by the way. They've also put in a freight loop.
I did say Hope Valley upgrade, not. Yeah.
Absolutely right. And so they've put a freight loop in at Bamford. But actually, Hugh Merriman was perfectly correct when he talked about it. I saw it in the press. He said, the challenge now is capacity at Sheffield Midland and Manchester Piccadilly. Well, actually, technically from sort of Hazel Grove into Manchester. The real ambition on the Hope Valley is 3 trains an hour, an extra fast one. But that's not possible even with this upgrade. What this will do is it will make it a lot more reliable. And
longer trains so that
yes.
you can carry people more comfortably. And there is a capacity uplift. Let's not be too
No, that's fair. But the real ambition is that third path, and that's not possible with this yet. But it's still it's good news. It's good news.
Good of you to point out that they didn't spend all that money on the station, because 150 million for a 2-platform station would make Haxby look like pocket money, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, that's my worry with some of these things, which is the numbers keep getting so big that then you start it's like boiling frog, isn't it? You look back and go, actually, maybe 20 million is quite a good deal. No, it's not a good deal. It's wrong.
And we will keep saying so. And of course, can we remind everybody, Richard, that your very kind offer for somebody to send you the figures for Haxby, and you can put your not inconsiderable abilities as an accountant to good work on reviewing every line and do a comprehensive look at how it all stacks up. So please do.
I'd love
if
to.
you want us to do that, Richard's there, ready, willing, and able.
And free.
And you don't often say that about accountants, do you? Well, that's all we got time for this week. We've had a bit of a blast, as usual. We had wanted to chat about the East Coast timetable, which is quite the story, but that's going to have to wait, though, hopefully for not too long. So thanks ever so much for watching.
Hang on. Before you do that, right? Sorry to butt in there, Nigel.
That's all right.
Steph and I, we like a good list.
Oh, you too, God.
Well, we've been looking at, you've just mentioned East Coast, it just reminded me. We've been looking at what we're doing over the next few weeks and some of the guests we've got coming on. And we can't say anything at the moment, but have you seen who's coming on the show in the next few weeks?
I have.
In the next month or so.
I couldn't possibly comment.
It's going to be, well, I mean, it's not just one person, it's quite a few. It's going to be amazing.
Anyway, look, thank you so much to you wonderful people out there who are watching and listening. Please don't forget to give us a thumbs up on YouTube. Leave a comment likewise, and please subscribe. The numbers are absolutely soaring, and it's incredibly useful, helps us to give you more of what you want. And develops the real strength and credibility of the channel. We're having no problems at all in getting guests to come on because it's been noticed. Thanks to you, we can conduct the orchestra, but you are the orchestra. The large numbers of people who provide the audience that gives us the impact. So please keep going. Stay with us. Join us again next week. And for now, it's goodbye from me in lovely Lincolnshire.
And it's goodbye from me.
We'll see you next week. Do join us.